Sunak under pressure to slash immigration. Is Keir Starmer a control freak and fancy a 4-day week? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Bim Afalami, Labour peer and former TUC boss Francis O'Grady, Reform UK's Alex Phillips and The Observer's Sonia Soda. Happy 75th birthday to the NHS, but not everyone has cause to celebrate.
Rapidly diagnosed with kidney cancer in November 2022. But since then I've had a very long and anxious and very frustrating wait.
That, Laura, is rationing. That is not a logical clinical decision.
If the government followed those recommendations, we believe it would cut around 400,000 off the net migration figures by the next election.
Rishi Sunak under pressure from Conservatives who want massive cuts to immigration.
I have two young girls, and this is about the inheritance that we leave them and everyone's grandchildren. I care about the environment and climate that we leave them.
And from others who think that despite those words, the Prime Minister is uninterested in the environment. Should encouraging tactical voting get you kicked out of Keir Starmer's Labour Party?
It's Thursday, just gone 3 o'clock, so about 3 hours' time, I'm going to start my weekend.
We have one life, and we can't spend it all in work.
The virtues of a 4-day week, but should council workers be offered it? Let's start with the health story you heard in the headlines and look at a longer version of what you heard there on the Laura Kunsberg Show.
Rapidly diagnosed with kidney cancer in November 2022. But since then I've had a very long and anxious and very frustrating wait with delays for surgery, which is not scheduled until later this month. Not good enough, like.
You had that clip from Kevin, who was waiting for kidney treatment for 8, 9, 10 months. That, Laura, is rationing. That is not a logical clinical decision. If someone has a need for an operation and you simply don't have the resources to give them what they need, then you're going beyond the important protocols of allocating scarce resources in the best way possible, and you're being defined by the amount of resources you have available.
Is Lord Bethell right, former Health Minister, that the NHS is rationing services?
Well, what he's right about is that the NHS is having to deal with a lot of pressures. It is in a less good position than it was before the pandemic because of the huge build-ups and backlogs that are there. And obviously, and you'd expect me to say this, there's a lot of effort going in to reducing those pressures.
Is it rationing, though, Bim? That is slightly different. I mean, it's not a word that we hear very often. No, but is it the same, effectively, as rationing if you're using waiting times, clinical criteria, administrative hurdles, waiting lists? Is it rationing?
Well, I don't really think that James Bethell was fully understood that every single time, whether you're in the private or public sector, where you have a fixed amount of resource and you have a demand that grows, because almost all demand in everything grows over time, you are obviously going to have to allocate resources according to what you have. That is just what every single family, every single government, every single service, every single organisation does. The word rationing is one that's actually bizarrely used often in the United States when they say, oh, publicly funded health systems are bad because they inevitably end up in rationing. Because in the US system, they say, well, what you just need to do is just keep on expanding the amount of private healthcare. I don't think that we're in the same system.
I mean, he was quite clear, I don't want to labour the point, but he was quite clear that this was a specific scenario. Listening to Kevin talking about the fact that he hasn't had an appointment because of long waiting lists, are they a form of rationing?
Long waiting lists are the result of not having enough resources to deal with the hugely increased demand that we've got. That's why we're increasing the amount of resources that we have, whether it be in terms of staff or the money or the capital spending.
Is clinical Are clinical decisions here still actually being used, or are long waiting lists a form of rationing?
There's no doubt about it. The NHS is on its knees. We had George Osborne going in front of the Public Inquiry Committee claiming that austerity hadn't prevented the NHS for preparing for the pandemic.
Well, he said the economy was better prepared as a result.
Well, it's a joke, frankly. We've had cuts and cuts and cuts. We've now got record waiting lists. We've got people like Kevin and millions of others who can't, many people can't even get an appointment at the GP, so they're, going to A&E because they have no choice. I mean, it is a disaster.
So you would say it is rationing?
Well, and I think if you don't pay your staff properly and you end up with massive shortages as a result, then, well over 100,000 shortages still, vacancies in the NHS.
Well, we're going
real problems.
What do you think? Is it rationing? Is James Bethell right?
The term they would use is triaging, isn't it? Which is prioritising based upon medical need. And if you're not going to imminently die from something, then you're going to have to wait. But this is not the sort of health service we should have in a G7 economy. It is utterly ridiculous, and especially when you look at the amount of money we pump into the NHS, that we have waiting lists like we do, that we have such a poor standard of care. And as somebody who spent a lot of her life living abroad and spent 3 years living in Belgium, where they have a European model healthcare system,
because you pay into a social insurance.
Yeah, you have a social insurance, exactly. Brussels is a very high density city with a huge immigrant population, and yet you can get a GP appointment the same day. And yet when you go to private hospitals, as most of them are, but they're also state hospitals, you get immediate care whether you're on welfare and going to a state hospital or going to a private hospital. I think we need to look at the model of the NHS.
All right, and that means paying into some sort of social insurance system.
It's just not true to say that we're pumping money into the NHS. When you look at the history of NHS funding, the NHS, since its inception, has received on average, a 4.4% real terms spending increase every year. That stopped in 2010.
There was a real terms increase, but obviously it was a far lower rate.
It was far lower. When in countries that are rich and ageing, you have to spend more on your healthcare every year in order to maintain the same levels of healthcare. We haven't been doing this in this country. If you look at international comparisons, we spend far less per person than countries such as Germany, France, Austria, Switzerland, for example. We've got fewer doctors and nurses per head of population than the OECD average, So we have been starving the NHS of resources. There's a staffing crisis, as Francis has been saying, and that is absolutely partly linked to pay. We get the health service that we pay for, and we are not investing enough money in healthcare in this country. We're spending less than other comparable countries.
So should there be higher taxes to pay for increased investment in the NHS?
Absolutely. We should be spending more on the NHS.
Do you agree that even before the pandemic, the NHS, they used the expression, was running hot? It was really at very, very high capacity, probably mid-90 to coming close to 100%.
Oh, I think that we definitely needed more capacity.
And that's because there wasn't enough investment.
We definitely needed more capacity in the NHS. And I've long said that in public and in private, both in terms of workforce and in terms of the capital spend, particularly in terms of hospitals.
So that was a failure of Conservative governments then?
No. What I'm saying is we should have built up more capacity. But the reason why we're facing the particular problems we have now is largely down to a pandemic backlogs that have built up hugely in that period of time.
I just don't think... I think obviously the pandemic has had an impact, but I don't think it's true to say it's largely because of that, because before the pandemic, we were having winter flu crises, for example, that we're seeing at certain points of the year, all non-urgent operations being cancelled in some hospital trusts. So obviously the pandemic has had an impact, but the NHS was in dire straits as a result of a decade of underfunding by Conservative governments, even going into the pandemic.
Well, let's look at some of the other pressures that are on the Prime Minister. Look at this headline in the Telegraph. Cut net migration by 2/3 or lose voters' trust, Sunak warned. Tory backbenchers urge Prime Minister to honour manifesto pledge of the party is to save face at the next general election. So this is a group of Conservative MPs calling themselves New Conservatives. There are quite a few groups, but this is New Conservatives. They've got a report out today saying that net migration should be cut. They have a specific number, 226,000 people per year. That's because the last Conservative manifesto in 2019 promised to cut the level of net migration. Otherwise, as the headline says, voters' trust in the Conservative Party will be eroded. Are they right that that pledge should be kept from the manifesto?
Of course we should try and keep our pledges, but since the manifesto we've had a few huge things happen in the world that have affected us, in particular in relation to immigration, not just COVID, which obviously had a huge economic impact, but also the difficulties that we've seen in the war in Ukraine. We've seen Hong Kong and the refugees coming from Hong Kong, and though those two groups were quite different in many respects. I just use those as just a couple of examples, which means that the world looks very different.
It has, although interestingly, Rishi Sunak, I seem to remember in the leadership contest, well, the Ukraine war had already started by then, still promising to bring down net migration numbers, and they've gone up.
Yeah, they have.
They're at the highest level. They were 540,000 and now 606,000. Now, that may be fine, but not according to this group of MPs. Do you accept it's bad for our democracy, as Tom Hunt, your colleague, said last night on the BBC, if those numbers aren't tackled?
I like Tom very much, but I don't think that what he's describing is correct. I do not believe that, frankly, a quite short-term increase in the level of migration. Also, we're looking at a net migration number. I know this sounds really technical, but it's really important because, you know, and I've never been a fan of talking about net migration because you can only control one half of that calculation, which is the number of people you let in. You can't control the number of people who leave or go in and out in the same period of time.
At the moment, it's very much tipped in the number of people coming in. Alex, what do you think?
I mean, the ambition to reduce net migration to over 250,000 a year once upon a time would have invited gasps of horror. You're talking about adding 1 million people to our population every 4 years. And we've got a housing crisis. We have an NHS crisis. It is very clear that this country is not keeping up when it comes to capacity and infrastructure with a growing population. And of course, there is also the very taboo debate to be had about integration and the social impact and the cultural impact, which is very often felt in communities along the coast, for example, or in big agricultural areas, where the nature of their high streets change at an exponential rate. I remember the Conservatives about 10 years ago saying they'd reduce the figures down to tens of thousands every year. It was only about a year ago we hit 250,000 and everyone went, wow, this is so high. It's only that we've gone up to over 600,000 now that suddenly 250,000 seems sustainable. Even that is too high. It is too much.
Is 606,000 sustainable as a number of net migration? We've got massive shortages in certain industries.
I think most people think these kind of broken promises on numbers are just daft. What people worry about are whether we're investing in training and apprenticeships for people who are local. Are we investing in that? And they worry about pay being undercut, like we saw in some of the big warehouses where pickers were being employed from abroad on agency contracts at less pay. Then we find out that the government has cut funding for further education by 38%.
So you don't think those numbers are sustainable at the moment?
And that Home Office rules are that you can pay workers coming into this country 1/5 less than the going rate. So I think it's really important that we get rid of that rule, that everybody gets the rate for the job, and that we invest in training.
So you actually agree with this group of Conservative MPs with some of their... Well, let me read you some of their... Well, you think they're balmy. Well, they're not here to respond, but you think they're balmy. You might not think some of their recommendations are, because it says things like significantly increasing the salary threshold for skilled workers, closing a scheme that gave eligibility to care workers, and also cutting back on students and their dependents. Are they good ideas?
Any worker doing the same job should get the rate for the job and have the right to join a trade union to represent them. Migrant workers have done incredible work for us in this country, where we have union recognition agreements and people get a fair rate for the job.
So
people are welcoming.
So 600 that you say, not to talk about the numbers, but then 600,000 on the basis of what you said is perhaps good for the economy.
If people are getting paid decently and we're investing in apprenticeships, of course. We want to grow this economy, don't we?
Just briefly, Francis says they're balmy, this group of MPs, putting forward these recommendations. Do you agree?
Well, I still think the ambition to reduce migration to 226,000 is balmy. I think it should be far lower than that. But I do totally agree with things that Francis is saying, such as making sure that you cannot import a cheap labour force, which compresses the wages of those at the thin end of the wedge in the UK. But, you know, something else we need to look at, and you mentioned it, Joe, is student spousal visas. The last time we had an OBR forecast into migration, what they said was the inward-coming population have the same rate of productivity as the domestic population. They equally have dependents and so on and so forth. Student spousal visas have gone through the roof.
Now, the government is saying it's going to tackle that and it's introduced policies to do so. What do you think about this group of MPs putting pressure just to keep a Conservative manifesto promise?
Well, I think it's extremely ill-judged as a set of recommendations, and the reason for that is there's two things to say. First of all, public concern about immigration has dropped dramatically since Brexit. So in 2016, over half of the public said that immigration was one of their top issues. Now it's down to 11% in late 2022. They are not with people like Alex. People are incredibly pragmatic about immigration. Concerns don't generally come from issues around either racism or cultural concerns. They are about the economics, and people feel that if it's beneficial for the economy and we've got control over it, they're happy for immigration to happen.
I mean, just to put in this poll by YouGov last week saying that 61% of the population think immigration has been too high over the last 10 years. How does that square? I mean, it may be lower than it was, but it's still high.
I think it's a lot to do with how you pose the question. So that's a question about the last decade, and I think people will be thinking about free movement when we were part of the European Union as part of that. If you look at what people say about immigration levels now, people don't think it's too high, and in fact 70% of the public say they're happy for people to come here as long as there are jobs. Now, when it comes to the NHS and social care, I mean, literally, the NHS would have fallen down even more without immigrant workers. The care system, that is even more true. When they say they want care workers to be paid more, government is one of the biggest employers of care workers. The reason why care workers are paid a pittance is because of government policy. It's not because of levels of immigration. So, I mean, I think we've got a real issue here where they are identifying the wrong solutions to long-standing issues in our economy around pay, around housing. It's not immigration that means we've got a housing crisis. It's the fact that we haven't been building enough houses and have got some of the highest rents in Europe.
Well, I'll come back to the issue of care workers because that's specifically mentioned by the group. But actually, on the other side of the Conservative Party, you've got a former minister, George Eustace, who's a Brexiteer as well, who is actually saying, no, we need more low-skilled immigration, probably for seasonal fruit picking, etc. He's coming at it from the other angle. How does Rishi Sunak square this?
I think he's got to focus on the economy, and I think he's got to focus on what people actually end up wanting rather than what sometimes certain people say that the public wants. And I think George Eustace, he knows rural affairs incredibly well. He himself was a farmer. He was in that department for 8-9 years.
And is he right?
He is right that in many areas that affect the rural economy, there is a lack of skills. We talked about care workers earlier. There is a lack of skilled people. Where I think these set of recommendations, where I agree with an aspect of them, is that I think that some of the graduate level visas that we've given out in terms of people's ability to stay for a very long time without having a job, I think that they're the sorts of things that we can clamp down on because I don't think they're helping our skills shortages. But if we laser focus on, and this not just in terms of immigration, but in terms of people in our own country, let's focus on what are the skills this economy needs and make sure we have.
Does that mean the numbers will stay broadly between 550 and 600,000 a year in net migration terms?
I don't know, because again, I make the point that the level of net migration is largely dependent on how many.
It would help if we had an industrial strategy, though, Bim, to be able to project what needs we have. You know, I mean, the industrial strategy was torn up when Greg Clark left. And we've never had one since. So we're not even planning what
I think
we need
a really important long-term point as well, which doesn't get discussed much, is we're an ageing society. So, I mean, this idea that we don't have room for people in our country is completely nuts. Actually, we have a choice. We have a choice between higher levels of immigration to make up for the fact that we've got an ageing society and falling birth rates, or we make younger people pay higher taxes to support the same level of health and care for an ageing population. That's a choice, and there are very few people who are anti-immigration who are willing to be upfront about that. It will be more expensive, higher taxes on the younger generation if you choose to clamp down on immigration.
Alex?
Well, there's a huge nuance to this, isn't there? I mean, you're right in many respects. We haven't been building enough houses. I don't understand the argument about importing skilled workers, because most of the sectors where the migrant workers are coming are the unskilled sectors. And this has a direct impact, as I said earlier, on those on the lowest pay. I mean, my father was a lorry driver all his life. He saw his salary go down year after year after year after year. And if he was still a lorry driver today, actually, he'd be starting to see an uptick because a lot of HGV drivers left after the pandemic. But when we look at things like falling birth rates as well, there are so many complex pressures the governments aren't dealing with, and they constantly reach to the solution of, well, do you know what, let's just bring in cheap workforce because this adds to GDP. This helps the profits of the big businesses continue to go up, and that is what the economy needs. But they're not looking at GDP per capita. They're not looking at wage compression. They're not looking at societal impacts. And these are very complex arguments. And the problem we've had actually for decades now is using inward migration as a sticking plaster to try and tape over big economic issues created by poor government policy, and at the same time shutting down a proper debate on migration by crying the word racist all the time.
I don't think I've cried the word racist.
No, sticking plaster. They have governments used immigration as a sticking plaster. It was Boris Johnson who famously said, don't reach for the lever of cheap immigration.
I think there is a lot in that, and that is one of the reasons why I was quite, in my last remarks, I said dealing with the people in our own country as well. When we're talking about skills, we have, for generations, probably over a century, not invested enough in skills in our country.
But if you agree on focusing on the economy, that does imply a continued level of relatively high immigration.
Well, it depends whether you're thinking short-term or long-term. And the answer is in politics, you need to think both. And in the very short term, let's take care workers, which, by the way, is not just, obviously, employed by the NHS, but they're a critical part of the economy.
Yes.
In the very short term, we need to make sure we have enough people to do that job. Over the longer period of time, of course, what do we need to do is not only need more British people, we need to raise the wages in that job, we need to raise the conditions in that job. But you've got to think of both in politics, and it's no use people saying, well, you know, we keep reaching for the sticking plaster. Yes, it is true that in some areas it's been seen as an easy fix, but we need to also recognise that people need skills now, and we need to make sure
that's why Labour's committed to a fair pay agreement, starting with social care, and I think that would give us the opportunity to focus not just on the money, but also on, you know, career paths and opportunities to progress in that sector, so it becomes, you know, has a status and people respect it, because, my God, after the pandemic, I think we all realised that having the majority of care workers on less than £10 an hour when they were putting their health on the line was just not fair or right. So, you know, there's a lot of work to do, but there's a bigger economic question, which is investment in the UK is low, growth is low, productivity is low. We've got to get to grips with that.
And immigration would help. Immigration would help remedy that, wouldn't it?
We need an industrial strategy with a skills investment as part of that, instead of cuts, which we've had progressively from the Tory government.
What level would Labour like to see net migration at? Just broadly, not a specific number, but broadly.
I genuinely don't think it's about numbers.
Well,
I think it's about the needs of the
61% of the population believe it's been too high overall, so that people would want to hear.
Numbers, how do you plan? This is the thing, it's not about numbers. How do you plan how many new hospitals you need, how many new houses you need? Of course it's about numbers.
That's what's called an industrial strategy. And at the moment, we haven't had one for years in this country.
And
it's completely daft.
So you do agree you would need a number? You know, once you've done your industrial strategy, you would need a number to go to the electorate and say, this is what we're planning for.
I think you'd be able to plan more clearly where the shortages are, where you genuinely need labour, and where you need to invest in skills and apprenticeships here too.
Right. I mean, do you see the proposal, the recommendation to actually cut the care workers off the occupation shortage list, that would be self-defeating at the moment when we have so many vacancies?
I think that would be absolutely self-defeating. Of course, we have a huge dearth of labour supply in the care sector, largely because the wages are abysmal, so most people wouldn't choose to go into it. Whereas from someone coming from another country, the comparative salary might be something they can come for a few years, do that job, go back and find they've got a degree of wealth.
So who would you cut off that list? Who would you cut off that list? Because, you know, if it's students and their spouses, that's restricted. Care workers you don't agree with. So where would you cut?
I also, when it comes to things like seasonal workers, I wonder why we can't be more imaginative imaginative and creative when we look at the huge influx of migrants coming in at the moment illegally or, you know, undocumented, when we look at people who are transitioning from prison life back into society, we should be able to be, when we look at students as well, I mean, we should be able to be more creative. Those jobs were traditionally filled by those people in this country. But when it comes to the NHS, and I totally agree with Sonia saying it would be on its knees if it wasn't for a migrant
So where
workforce.
would you cut then?
That. Why are we capping medical students in this country? That to me is insane.
But if you want to reduce immigration, which one of those groups of people that we're employing to come to this country for now, which one would you cut?
Like I said, seasonal workers, I think it's up to the farmers to actually be more creative about what they do and lobby hard to the government about how we fill those gaps in the market. I think where you've got any sort of oversubscription in the labour market, in any particular sector, and I'm not sitting there in the Treasury and knowing, you know, where the gaps in the labour market are. I'm not in Whitehall. But it seems to me quite obvious that we need to have a look at the system as a whole and look at the barriers for entry and say that, frankly, what is going on now, and especially as the OBR said, the inward migration flows are not any more productive than the domestic population. That is not filling gaps,
just on that point, and I've looked into this, part of the reason why our immigration numbers are high is that we've got a thriving higher education sector. And the number of international students which are included in the immigration numbers, and there was a big debate many years ago, which, Joe, I'm sure you remember, about whether they should be included or not, but they are included at the moment. That really skews the numbers, particularly around the things we've talked about around, you know, spousal visas for students.
We're one of the only countries in the world you don't have to pass an English language proficiency test to come to university here. I mean, there are other ways of...
But what I think is key is that when people do analysis and say, well, per head, you know, immigrants are no more productive or no more skilled than the native population, that is particularly true because you're including a huge number of students and seasonal workers in that. The point of our immigration policy, how we've tried to change it since Brexit, I'm not saying we've got it right completely, is to identify the skills we need, focus on bringing in people to do those skills, whilst at the same time, over the long term, building up the right strategy.
Why isn't Rishi Sunak able to persuade his own ranks? I mean, apart from the economic issues, there seems to be a real political issue here, that Rishi Sunak can't get a grip on his own people to rally behind one particular policy.
Why is that?
I think that what happens to parties sometimes is that when, particularly after all the political chaos of 2022, when some groups start to behave in a certain way, you get this sort of copycat behaviour. And so it becomes very, very difficult when everybody who gets a small group together now feels emboldened to go out and argue for things. Now, in some ways, that's good because, you know, we don't want a return to the sort of Blair Brown years where no dissent was allowed, nobody was allowed to say anything that wasn't on the pager.
So you're welcoming dissent?
By Alistair Campbell. No, I'm saying in some ways it's good to have open debate in the party, that people feel honest enough to say, look, this is what I want to do. As we come to the next manifesto, these are the ideas we want to put forward. I think that's good. We don't want a political system where nobody's allowed to say anything. But at the same time, of course you're right, what we've got to do as a party is, yes, have this discussion, but get in the same boat and row in the same direction.
Well, let's hear a little bit more of the dissent that's so healthy, it seems, for politics, or certainly for Rishi Sunak, because another challenge is on climate change and net zero. On Friday, you'll remember that Lord Zach Goldsmith, he resigned as a minister, heavily criticising Rishi Sunak's commitment on the environment. He said this in his lengthy resignation letter. The problem is not that the government is hostile to the environment, it's that you, our Prime Minister, are simply uninterested. That signal, lack of it, has trickled down Whitehall and caused a kind of paralysis. But there are also those in the party who think the government is going too fast on net zero. We can show you this in the Mail on the front page, asking for the government to put the brakes on what it calls a damaging 2030 petrol and diesel car ban. Let's start with Zach Goldsmith. Is he right? Rishi Sunak doesn't care about the environment.
He's not right, but I say that by also saying that I know Zach well, and he did amazing work for the party and the country on the environment.
So why would he
that's
say
not
it?
A personal thing for me to him. Well, because I think that and it's also worth saying, you know, he's very close to Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister. I think that what Boris Johnson was very, very good at was performing, and the performative aspect of politics. I think all of us would accept that. And that, when he's talking about signals, you know, if you are very performative as an individual, you can give an impression that you're very in favour of something. And by the way, Boris was very in favour of the environment.
But he didn't actually act on it.
What I'm saying is, I think that Rishi Sunak is a very different style of politician, and he's not as performative. And that may be perceived by Zach and others as, oh, he's not interested. That isn't true. We've actually kept the same policy posture almost I'm a member of the Conservative Environment Network. I'm very close to a lot of this. We've maintained the same policies all this period of time. Yes, is Rishi Sunak less demonstrative and performative than Boris Johnson? Yes, I think he is.
Is that because he doesn't believe in it in quite the same way?
No, because I think that saying I believe something really loudly and strongly doesn't change the actions that someone takes. What I'm saying is we've maintained the same policies that we've had over a long period of time.
Or is it,
and
as Rishi
Sunak
made clear, it's because of what Lord Zach Goldsmith said about the Privileges Committee, who were looking into Boris Johnson and Partygate, and he undermined that committee and was told off for it and cited and called to apologise. And that's why he resigned.
Well, I don't know why he resigned, but as I said, he is very close, to Boris Johnson, so maybe that played a part in it.
Is the UK squandering its leadership on climate change?
Well, we failed to deliver against the vast majority of targets. I mean, the government's own climate change committee has pointed out that the government has failed to deliver. But it seems to me this is much more about the political knives being out. The supporters of Boris Johnson, who certainly was performer is one word for it, but, unhappy about they just can't accept Rishi Sunak as leader, and it feels pretty chaotic.
I mean, do you think then that Labour, rolling back on its commitment, particularly on the £28 billion of investment into climate change policies, it's going to do it, but perhaps not from the get-go, and it's promised not to accept or approve future oil and gas licences, but they will allow everything to go through right up until they win the next election, as they hope?
I think Labour, and particularly Rachel Reeves, has been very, very clear that this is about ramping up the investment. Any new government coming into power will have to look at the books.
But she's delaying it. She's delaying it. Or she's saying she'd like to delay it.
Absolutely committed to ramping it up, because it's the centrepiece of what Labour intends to do: a greener economy, a just transition on jobs, and improving our productivity and growth so that we can start repairing our public services.
Are Labour really as committed, or are they realising it's perhaps not affordable, as some in both the Labour and Conservative parties believe?
Well, I think they're a lot more committed than the Conservative Party, clearly, because I take what Bim said about the policy still being there, but I agree with Francis that you have to measure progress against policies. And, the Independent Committee on Climate Change has said the UK, there's lots of red on that report, because the UK is not making the progress that we need to see against our climate change commitments. I think it's very clear that Labour has made greening the economy, massive investment, a huge part of their agenda. Obviously, the test will be what they do in government, but it's certainly a bigger part of the agenda for that party than it seems to have been for the Conservatives.
So, look, and I hear that criticism, and I know Lord Deben, John Gummer and the people on that committee have done great work over many years. The thing that has changed, in particular, in the international climate is the war in the Ukraine and the renewed focus, which maybe should have been there before, on energy security. Because the way I see it, energy security is greener and more renewable energy, because it's more wind, it's more solar, it's more nuclear, hydroelectric, all the other things that we can control in our own country. But, and this is the really tough thing, in order to get to that point, in order to transition to that point, in the short term, we are going to need to control more and get more oil and gas in the very short term. Why do we need that? Because we need to, first of all, get the critical minerals out of the ground that are required to make these wind and solar panels. We're going to need to ensure that prices remain low enough for people and businesses to be able to run their businesses. Because I can tell you, the thing that will damage the green movement more than anything else is prices going sky high. So it's a complicated message and people don't like to hear it. But in the short term, in order to make the transition properly, we are going to need more oil and gas that we can control in this country.
Well, and Labour seems to have signed up broadly to that until they say they win the next election. But who's right on this?
Bim is absolutely right. When you look at historically what we've done to our own fossil fuel extraction is we've cut it in the last decade by around 30%. Meanwhile, we've been importing fossil fuels at an increase of 30%. So you can see what's happening here. And the thing is about carbon emissions is they don't care what national boundaries are. They just go up into the atmosphere. And what we've done as a country is essentially exported the ability to advance the technology by sticking to, in many respects, arbitrary targets, while China has been using fossil fuels and lithium extraction and all the rest of it to get a leap ahead. They're actually emitting carbon into the atmosphere to make some of the things that then we'll import to try and cut it. And, you know, when you look at the base load of our national grid, we do need fossil fuels. We had to phone up Qatar over the winter to get LNG. Thank the Lord they gave it to us, otherwise Mrs. Miggins would be in a pretty poor state. And energy security is absolutely vital. The other problem I have with a lot of the net zero policy, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have an ambition to protect the planet and the environment, is historically it has taken money from the most vulnerable and given it to those who have money. When you look at wind farms, for example, the green levy on the bills of everybody, even those living in fuel poverty, and then that goes to big wealthy landowners to stick turbines on their grounds. There needs to be a better, more even-handed approach to this that takes common sense and pragmatism, and in that respect, BIM is right. You will need in the short term fossil fuel extraction to fund a transition.
What do you say about people on lower incomes? People less well off are the ones who will probably pay the highest price for green policies.
Do you know what's so frustrating to me is that we've had 13 years of a Conservative government. We have been saying, including in the trade union movement, we need a balanced energy policy. One of the reasons our inflation is so high is because we're so dependent on expensive energy imports. You know, that's left the UK more exposed than other countries. And we wanted investment in renewables, solar, tidal, as well as wind. And instead, we get to this stage where people are saying, oh, since the war in Ukraine, we better start thinking about energy security. We should have been thinking about it years ago.
Well, I know, but this is that, you know, you're always looking, as of course rightly in the opposition, looking back over the last 13 years. But now, if you want to win the next election, Chris Skidmore has a suggestion. This is a Tory MP. If you're both voting on this, which way would you vote? He's saying he's tabled amendments to the energy bill at report stage, including legislating for no new coal mines, ban on gas flaring and venting, 2035 net zero power grid, agreement on an end date for new oil and gas licences, leaving energy charter treaty. Would you vote for it?
So where I agree with BIM is that we need what we call a just transition.
Sure, but would that be part of it?
Plan.
Yeah, but would you vote for that?
I would vote for a proper plan that sets out how we're going to meet those climate targets.
But what's wrong with those? What's wrong? He's thought about it, Chris Skidmore. He's done a lot of work.
And do it in a way that makes sure that it's not ordinary working people paying the price.
BIM?
I don't agree with all of those.
OK.
I think that, and Chris has done a huge amount of work, but the problem with, for example, a net zero energy grid, what does he think that everybody's been trying to do? We're trying to upgrade the grid so that we can take all the stuff I was talking about, the wind, the solar, more nuclear, in this country. We're desperately trying to upgrade the grid. We're doing as much as we can, working with the National Grid on that. And putting an arbitrary date in law isn't going to make that happen any faster.
All right.
So, you know, he's broadly saying a lot of things that I'm not convinced is actually going to make a difference. What we need to do is improve our energy security and make sure we have cheap, clean energy for British individuals.
That might take quite some time. Let's talk about the Labour Party and Keir Starmer. This headline in The Guardian. After 44 years, Labour moves to expel me, and my MP and activist friends are asking who will be next. The me is Neil Lawson, director of the left-leaning think tank Compass, and he says he's been kicked out for retweeting a Liberal Democrat post from 2021 encouraging voters in Oxford to vote tactically for another party, in this case, the Green Party. He wrote that article today from the headline in The Guardian, and this is what Labour MP Clive Lewis had to say in response. You can see he's retweeted the article, and at the top, he broadly says, messed up beyond all recognition. Has Keir Starmer done the right thing in terms of kicking Neil Lawson out of the party?
He hasn't. Neil hasn't.
He's got a warning that it's going to happen. Come on, let's not mess around with semantics. He's had a warning saying he's going to be kicked out of the party. Has he done the right thing?
He hasn't. He's had a warning that he's being investigated.
No, I think the warning is he's going to be kicked out of the party for encouraging people to vote, or Labour voters to vote for a different party. broadly, has he done the right thing, Keir Starmer?
There is a rule in the Labour Party that you can't encourage people to vote for other parties because you belong to this party.
So he's done the right thing.
And I assume that's the same in other parties too. But what I would say, and obviously I can't comment on the internal processes of a particular case.
On that principle that you've just said, if you encourage people to vote for a different party, should you be kicked out?
What I would say is that there's a difference between dissent and disloyalty, and I think we'll end up discovering this as a bit of a storm in a teacup. I very much hope so.
But it's not a storm in a teacup.
Is he going to be? Should he be kicked out or shouldn't he?
That will have to. There is an internal process, as every party has. There are clear rules against which it will be tested. But as I say, I very much hope that dissent isn't confused
indignation
with
here from Bim.
I mean, Francis, you're well respected for your integrity and your leadership for many years. But I find this really hard when you've got a leader who deliberately keeps off somebody like Jamie Driscoll in the North East, who's an excellent mayor who works cross-party, and kicked him off basically because of he didn't like him or didn't do something. Keir Starmer behaves in an incredibly autocratic way, and I'm very surprised that you aren't saying, listen, Keir, you've got to have a broad church and you've got to allow people room to breathe occasionally.
I very much believe in a broad church.
Why is it that you're not willing to criticise him for somebody who's just retweeted an article? This seems bizarre.
You have to follow your own rules in any organisation. Well, certainly when I led the TUC...
Would you be happy for somebody to advocate, a Conservative, to advocate voting for Alex in a different party?
No, I would not.
No, and would you get rid of, kick them out?
Well, I think that if you have rules, as Francis said... But hold on. But the point, Joe, I'm trying to make is... it's the style of how Keir Starmer runs his party.
What's the style? Let's stick to the specific, though, Bim.
He's very aggressive.
He has never sacked a single minister.
He
waits for them to resign.
The Conservative Party from one day to the next, quite frankly. I mean, you're a broad church with no faith, which has left us in a situation where we had 3 different prime ministers in a year, which definitely contributed to our economy having a huge downturn because no one knows which direction the UK is going. I mean, what all of this says to me is we've got to use Clive Lewis's term of FUBAR. What is FUBAR? It's the two-party system.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
It is the fact that we live in a two-party system where voters feel they don't actually have a choice and the parties end up turning in on themselves. Party first, squabble, squabble, squabble. What about running the country?
A bit more squabbling before we go. What is going on here? Is Clive Lewis right or is Keir Starmer right?
I mean, I do think this is taking this party rule a bit too far, quite frankly, and I do think it makes the party look a bit ridiculous. And I think it should go away and look at this rule again, because the Labour Party is a broad church. There's a range of views on electoral reform. Neil Lawson is pro-proportional representation. That means you are going to be open to talking about electoral pacts and things like that. This is tactical voting. It goes on in our system. And I think even sending him a warning letter and saying that he's under investigation, it makes the Labour Party look a bit ridiculous. So I just think they need to rethink that rule, essentially.
All right. Listen, I'll just tell everybody the on-air times because they've changed. We've all been up very early this morning. Thank you to our guests. You can see them here. During Wimbledon, week 1, Monday the 3rd of July today. Tuesday, 10:15 to 11. Wednesday, normal time, 11:15 to 1 o'clock. And Thursday, 10:15 to 11 o'clock. Make a note for it and make sure you get up on time. Just briefly before we go, the 4-day week. I'll show you this headline. Minister asks South Cambridgeshire Council to end 4-day week trial. It has been something, as the Minister called it, of an experiment, and he wants it to end, Lee Rowley. Why? Yes or no?
I'm against it. I think we need to be increasing our productivity, getting more stuff done in our local government and not paying... I mean, if people want to take a 20% reduction in pay, that's reasonable. But I think that, we should have a full day, we should have a full week, like most people in this country.
4-day week, for and against, for councils.
The 4-day week on our 150th anniversary as a TUC, that, as with last century, we campaigned for the 8-hour day and for a weekend. This century, we should be campaigning for a 4-day week. AI, artificial intelligence, opportunities for multi-billion-pound productivity gains. Let's share them fairly, not just money, but time.
4-day week?
It doesn't seem to me, in a cost of living crisis with huge shortages in the labour market, that right now is exactly a fecund environment in which to conduct this experiment.
All right, so you think it should end?
You know, all I'm saying is there are a lot of sectors out there, nurses, doctors, for example, where we have shortages who don't get the luxury of a 4-day week. I just don't think the time is now in a cost of living crisis to conduct this experiment.
I made a programme on Radio 4 for this 3 years ago. I'm a big supporter of it in principle. We used to work 80-hour weeks. That time gradually came down and then it stalled as a result of weaknesses in the trade union movement, actually, you know, trade unions having less power. I think it's a fine aspiration for us all to be working less. I think we can afford it over the long term. I have two concerns. One is really workers, you know, when there are big inequalities in working power, it means that low-paid workers are more likely to miss out, so we've got to sort that out. Secondly, we actually work a 32-hour week on average because of working mothers going part-time. I think more fathers should go part-time, and that would be a more equitable way to aspire to a 4-day working week, all parents working part-time.
Bye!